Well, one of these rosters won $50,000 this weekend. That is pretty exciting when we have, well, there's 4 here in the room, but we also have our good buddy Zachary Kruger, who couldn't join us. He is traveling at the moment over the holidays. We'll talk a little bit about his team as well, because the RotoViz Best Ball show, he was on with me for that series last year. And these are the teams that I'm certainly rooting for this week, but I am rooting for OT more than the other teams. I will hold my hands up and admit that. I'm sure each individual person here will admit that as well. We're recording this before Thursday Night Football. We will be talking a little bit about players involved in that, mainly from our roster, with the Jets and the Browns going head-to-head there. We'll also talk about some of the injury news, possible implications, and the rostership percentages across the board. But we're kicking things off in OT. I think, Shawn, this may be one of the first 4-person shows we have ever done in the history of OT. So this one should be fun. We're going to bounce around all the teams. But Shawn, just tell the listeners why we're going to win this contest this weekend. That's all we really care about.
Well, as you mentioned, we have some Thursday Night Football, which always throws a wrinkle into these Thursday during the day shows. But Colm, Justin Fields, you really need one quarterback in the Superflex here. Just the one QB, because with the way the scoring format works, you need the rest of your players to hit in a way that they knock your second QB out, which is also something we need since we don't have a second QB.
So, we also haven't had a second QB, Shawn, the last 2 weeks either. Let's be clear.
Well, Justin Fields missed a chunk of time, and Sam Howell carried us. And everybody who's frustrated with Sam Howell, which I very justifiably, there are many people like that, he did what he needed to do to get us to this point. And now Justin Fields has to do his job. He was the first-round pick. He's got to do it. But Colm, we are going to win because we have, and we are the only team that has, Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, and James Cook. That trio there, if they all hit, obviously individual players there are covered. We've got the trio. They all go off. We win it. But Colm, I mean, this is so much fun to be in this for the second year. A couple of years ago, when we were in the normal contest, we had Mike Leone on the show. We have 2 of our favorite people with us today, and it's such a great OT connection here because Tom made it through the OT Listener League, which is our favorite draft every year. And then Erik and I have been doing some drafts together. He was in the contest the previous year to draft with me. We drafted a team in the 350 version of the FFPC. We did a number of teams together this year. He did a fantastic job filling in when I was traveling earlier this year, hosting the show. Tom, Erik, so excited to have you guys on. And I mean, I feel like one of your 2 teams is going to win it.
So you're going for their teams are going to come out on top. The one thing I want to let the listeners know is Tom did let us know before we started recording here that the team he drafted in the OT Listener League, he was cooking some, I believe it was some curry you were cooking, Tom, while drafting that roster, and you've come out on top there.
It was moussaka, which is a Mediterranean dish, and yeah, I seem to remember I tend to cook moussaka because it's my wife's favorite dish. Normally when I'm in a little bit of trouble, I want to get back into the good books, but also if there's a reason where, like, you know, I'm trying to find a bit of extra time where I can squeeze out of a weekend or squeeze into an evening, then looking for those dishes where I'm like, right, this is going to take me an hour and a half to make. I've got enough time to draft in this period, and I wasn't going to miss the RotoViz Overtime Listener League because they're a lot of fun. And this one, I believe I was drafting after you guys. You guys were at the 106. I was at the 107. And it wasn't my favorite draft when I finished in there, but it had a lot of players who I liked. You know, I had Zay Flowers, Jordan Addison in there, who I felt like had a lot of upside. Deebo Samuel was someone who I was very high on this year. I thought he was being undervalued. And yeah, I kind of got by at running back really enough with Jalen Warren, Bijan Robinson, Brian Robinson, Gus Edwards, these kind of guys who've just done enough. But one of the big things for me was Puka Nacua, who I took, I think it was in the 20th round, who was a player who just wasn't drafted everywhere in these leagues. And going into this weekend, he's 10% rostered, which is perhaps, I kind of hoped he might be sub 10% in this 50-man final, but is still a good enough difference maker. But the real thing, which we can't just ignore here, is my team is the only team in the finals to have Jacoby Brissett, the now starter for the Commanders. So if Jacoby Brissett is what you need, then I'm winning this 50K.
Yeah, I thought you were trying to get into like the good books with me and Shawn with the conversation starters here. Not the fact that there's 2 teams in this final with Sam Howell and we're one of them. And now that the fact we have 1 quarterback is due to that. And but you never know when you get into the final situations here, having every piece you can. So obviously we're losing a piece, and that's an advantage for you. But having that piece, you look at how some of the teams are made up in this. For example, your team is a Baker Mayfield team who is. There's 17 out of the 50. There's 50 teams in this final, 34% rostered. So, like, he's got you here, but ideally for you in this situation with one Jacoby Brissett team, he would be the one that has a big day, and it helps give you an edge from that perspective. We have to ask Erik, though. Erik, were you cooking while drafting, or do you remember the experience in that much detail?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have nearly as exciting of a story of drafting mine. I don't remember drafting it. It was a slow draft. Did a lot of the slow Superflex drafts. Always have something going and something on the mind to mull over. But yeah, very excited for the team. I got a Rams super stack going into the weekend, which I feel good about, other than not having Kyron Williams. So I'm pretty scared of a 3 touchdown on the ground game as they battle the Giants this weekend. But yeah, feeling good about the team and the contest as a whole. It's interesting to see all the different ownerships across the board, and the different players that are represented heavily and not heavily. I was looking last night. I think like there's no AJ Brown teams. There's 1 Kelsey team. So it's funny how kind of the sifting sand of the year in the last few weeks can kind of eliminate some players that would be pretty dangerous here at the end.
Yeah, really much over the last couple of weeks in particular, as some of the players who would have been really projected to be heavily owned have tailed off. And then, like, for example, James Cook, who may have pushed a lot of these teams into advancing at the end of the line there. We have James Cook. Shawn mentioned the 3 we have, but only 4 James Cook teams in it at an 8% rostership there. So there's a couple of interesting players like that across the board. There's other players then, which I'll show up here. We'll go through some of the highest rostered players. And I find it a little bit interesting to see some of these names, and some of the names that are higher rostered that may be concerned. People may be listening to this after Thursday Night Football. Amari Cooper is somebody who has had some injury reports over the week. He is one of the higher owned players, highest owned wide receiver on the board, 15 teams, 30%. So that would obviously impact, depending on his Thursday night performance, the outlook for a lot of teams here. None of us having him on the team, but you have a David Njoku team, Erik, which, if Amari Cooper is not 100%, they may go through the tight end there. That's the way that team has gone the last couple of weeks between those 2 guys. Jordan Addison with his ankle injury, Cortland Sutton is in concussion protocol, Isaiah Pacheco's in concussion protocol, Cole Kmet has a knee injury. As of time of recording on Thursday, he has not yet practiced, so we'll see what happens there. But the players you would expect to be heavily rostered, Christian McCaffrey is on 29 of the teams. That is 58%. Breece Hall then, it drops all the way down to 24%. And I think, if it's a player on a 5th of the rosters in these, based on the combinations then beyond that, I think this is quite a diverse field outside of Christian McCaffrey and Baker Mayfield, Amari Cooper and Sam Laporta. They're the only players at 30 or above. And then you have Mike Evans at 28%, Adam Thielen 26, and Chris Olave at 24. But I was looking at some information just before we started recording, which I thought was interesting in terms of the construction. So Jared Goff and Sam Laporta. Goff is the 2nd highest rostered quarterback. We have Sam Laporta then as the highest rostered tight end. There is no Goff, Sam Laporta teams stacked in this final, which I thought was quite interesting. I thought he would have been a piece that people would have been trying to add into those Goff rosters, but obviously based on ADP may not have been getting done very often. Then Baker Mayfield and Mike Evans, both of those heavily rostered as a combination, but less than half of those. So there's 47% of the teams, 8 of those having that combination. And then Fields with Kmet is kind of on the opposite side. There's less teams. There's 5 of them, but that is 83% of Justin Fields' teams are paired with Cole Kmet. So again, we'll see what his status will be for Sunday. Looking at some of the players here that are on the high side, were we expecting some of these to be more highly owned, Shawn? Were we expecting it to be balanced? I think this is a very balanced across the board final with lots of players then, sub 10% that will be very interesting this weekend.
Yeah, when you look at these quarterbacks, it's interesting to see Mayfield there after, he takes so much flack in the offseason. There are questions about if he'll even be the starter. I had wrote I had written pretty favorably about the potential for Mike Evans and Chris Godwin to outperform because Baker Mayfield was either going to be a much lesser drop from Tom Brady or perhaps even an upgrade. Of course, the players I wanted to target there were Evans and Godwin, not necessarily Mayfield. He makes it through. I guess I'm a little bit surprised that he's that high, even with what he has done. Of course, it's going to be a little bit different here than in Best Ball Mania, for example, because all of the starting quarterbacks are very valuable. And when you have that sort of two pieces together, again, one of the things I do want to emphasize, I presented it in a half-joking manner earlier, but I don't think you necessarily want to have two QBs in your lineup. It's interesting that Mayfield is able to pull so many of these teams through. I guess I'm not that scared of the Mayfield-Evans match, but it is interesting to see. Tom, as you look at this, who are you most scared of? Is it a situation where, and if I'm remember what I looked at, I mean, neither you, Tom, nor Eric have Christian McCaffrey. Are you most worried about being buried by the half of teams that have him? Or do you have some other guys here where you're thinking that's the guy who is really a problem for my roster? I mean, obviously the whole thing here, I mean, any of these guys that go off you don't have, it's going to be problematic. But as you're looking at these games, as you're looking at the builds, what are you most scared of?
Yeah, and I think what you mentioned about quarterbacks is really interesting as well, because you look at sort of like the top 6 guys in sort of 7 or 8 guys really in rostership in this final. And only Justin Fields at 12% was somebody who was being consistently taken in the first round. What we see is guys who provided value later on. And it has been the Christian McCaffrey and even Breece Hall kind of drafters that have really dragged teams to the final in some cases. So not having Christian McCaffrey feels quite daunting, particularly with them playing the Commanders, who are like bottom 2 defense in both run and pass DVOA. My hedge really will have to be that Debo is going to get more of the points. But I mean, we've just seen from Christian McCaffrey, the Niners, they're not easing off on him in any way. They're giving him huge workloads every week. So I think he can be particularly, a difference maker this week. Jahmyr Gibbs as well, like he's become, strength to strength over the last few weeks, RB3 in kind of back-to-back games. And the game against the Cowboys isn't necessarily the best match, but you look at the over-unders and it's a 54-point over-under, by far the highest of the weekend. So part of me worries about what my roster, which is very much Sunday heavy in its players, is going to be facing to climb. But I think looking at the other quarterback pairings in this final, I have Lamar Jackson and Dak Prescott. I already mentioned Jacoby Brissett and Baker Mayfield. And I think that if elite quarterback play shines through this weekend, and if Lamar has an incredible game against Miami, which we saw him do at the beginning of last season, and Dak Prescott, if he lives up to his part of this 54-point over-under, that could make a big difference for me. And it would make potentially a bit of a difference for the 16% Michael Gallup shares, which are in there. He hasn't been particularly good this year, but like if he came out of nowhere and had a big game, that might make a bit of a difference to that area of the draft against players who were drafted who maybe aren't performing in that sort of area.
And I think it's interesting as well when you mention some of this stuff there about the players that have gone through, but the first and second round, if we look at that from when these teams would have been drafted, it really is, well, obviously in Superflex, it might be the first 4 rounds, but it is very much focused on the higher end running backs that have advanced here. And then you mentioned some of the quarterbacks you have. So it's been quite a unique season. And then even the playoff weeks have been quite unique with how some of the players who maybe got people here didn't perform. But, some players, even like a Chris Olave, who had missed quite a bit of the season in and out and not having huge performances, being one of the higher drafted players. And Thielen had a good start, but really tailed off and then had an okay week last week. It's interesting just to see how that has played out. Eric, anything for you standing out on the higher rostered players before we move into the lower guys?
Yeah. So I thankfully do have Christian McCaffrey, so I'll sleep good on Saturday night going into Sunday, knowing that he definitely would scare me if I didn't have him on my roster. was telling Shawn, I think by email, that I honestly did not draft that much Christian McCaffrey, and I probably drafted the most of him in the Superflex contest. Once you got to the back half of the first round, all the quarterbacks kind of dried up, and he was a pick for me there a lot. So thankful that I did that here in this contest a bit. I think the guys I'm probably the most scared of are actually over in the tight end column. As much Laporta as I drafted and as much McBride as I drafted, I have neither of them, and honestly, no.
Tell us about it.
Yeah, what I would call elite tight ends. So I definitely am scared of a big tight end score week. So for me, I'm putting a lot of hope in Njoku. Hopefully he can get me, at least 15 plus. I know he's had a couple real big weeks. I'm not expecting another, 30-point outing, but something there that can at least get me by. And hopefully, guys like Kittle, guys like Laporta and McBride will, at least for this week, keep it tamped down. It's very odd rooting against guys you've been rooting for all season, but those are a couple guys that I hope have a little more ho-hum days.
Yeah, it does feel strange, but that is the way sometimes in these contests you do have to root. So we'll move into the lower roster guys. And if I was looking at one name there, and sometimes it's not the guy who is at the top of the list, so those guys with green beside them that are really heavily owned, but we obviously, you mentioned Debo, we have Christian McCaffrey. George Kittle has had a number of plays over the last couple of weeks where he is nearly going 75 yards for a touchdown, and it feels like, although the volume isn't really there, like he is really looking as good as he has over the last couple of years. And he is somebody who, we have seen in the past, those 2 or 3 touchdown games. So Kittle, even on 6 rosters, could be somebody who absolutely annihilates the entire slate here for this particular contest. So moving into the lower roster players, and I find it quite interesting because some of the names that aren't on this but are just above it, for example, Dak Prescott was in the quarterback side for the higher roster players, with CeeDee Lamb only on 5 rosters, which is 10% of the teams in this. There's some names down at the bottom end here which get very intriguing, but I have split this into quarterbacks, running backs, and tight ends. We'll look at this first, but we do have the wide receivers then coming up. Any names here, Shawn, for you again standing out as surprised at just this? Well, Travis Kelce's probably that with one team, true, maybe be the one, but there's 3 Kyle Pitts teams. Shawn, we're rooting for Pitts this week. He may be our only tight end available. Anyone else standing out for you that it seems like there would have been more of these teams getting through?
Well, I do have to mention Pitts and say that we are projecting an
career game,
8 for 120 and 2 game for him. I mean,
as Ben and I just this week,
manifested it into being. We think Jalen Waddle he's either going to be out or just like, how could you possibly play him? We're going to be playing him on our main event team that's in 14th, which means, he's going to carry all of these teams to victory. It's going to be a Kyle Pitts week. After the week, this question of, like, is Kyle Pitts a bust? Is it his fault? Is it Arthur Smith's fault? That's going to all be in the past because he has such a big game. Now, it's interesting to look at some of these here. Obviously, when you look at Kyler Murray, when you look at Jalen Hurts, those guys have the potential to
Jalen Hurts, one Jalen Hurts team, amazing.
Yeah, only 4 Allen teams. 0
2 teams.
Yeah.
That's what I mentioned about, obviously there's less chance that completely overtakes the rest of the field because of the lower percentage, but big Jalen Hurts week this week, and getting, like you mentioned, with the potential for Lamar to do it, that 30+ point quarterback week can really make a big difference in this format.
And we thought it was an advantage for us that James Cook timed his poor game such that there are only 4 teams in. We would love to see him go off. Najee Harris continues to hold his own in that battle with the Steelers. It's always possible that he gets, 2 or 3 touchdowns because he's breaking some tackles. He doesn't have the explosiveness. He's clearly not their better player, but if he's going to get that opportunity, if Mason Rudolph actually moves the ball, when you think about unlikely outcomes, but outcomes that certainly the scenario is there. You think about these goal line backs. Derrick Henry could have an absolutely massive game. There's the potential for the Lions to play well and David Montgomery to hit 4 touchdowns. I remember playing in one of these finals. I think it was D'Angelo Williams and the big back for the Giants at the time. One of you guys will have to fill a name in.
Bradshaw? No.
They combined for 7 touchdowns in that game. They were both on the roster against. There's the potential for huge touchdown games for some of these running backs. Kyron Williams jumping out there with only the 4 teams. That part is surprisingly. Certainly those 4 managers have to be excited about what he could potentially do. Tom, and there's going to be a 30-point game somewhere here, possibly a 40-point game. I mean, do you have a guy that looks like he could go off for 40 here and be like the definitive player in this title weekend?
I don't think it's going to be Najee, but Najee really scares me this weekend because the Seahawks' run defense is like the 5th worst team in run defense DVOA over the last 5 games. And it just feels like, you know, Jalen Warren's advanced at a higher rate. I took a good stance on Jalen Warren this year, but Najee Harris coming back to bite me right in week 17 championship weekend would feel very on brand. I think looking at these players, I mean, Joe Mixon's had so much opportunity at times. Like we saw last week, he had a bit more work than Chase Brown had, you know, been eaten into. I think that in terms of the matchups, the Chiefs' run defense is terrible. So I think that Joe Mixon could be okay, but I don't think he's probably really got like a 30-point game in him. Looking at it though, I mean, if we went down to 4%, I have Bijan Robinson, who's like only on 2 rosters, and Bijan Robinson just feels like he's always on the cusp of these things before Arthur Smith's him. And we saw last week, like he had a 36% target share, 10 targets, which were a career high. So that's what I keep telling myself, that the big blow-up game is coming with the low advance rate like you want. But the team with Travis Kelce, I was looking at their roster. They've also got Tyreek Hill. And it feels like if those 2 players combine and really go off, that could create a kind of gulf, which is going to be pretty difficult for the rest of us to really try and claw back.
So we'll jump over to wide receivers for the less than 10% guys, and we'll let Erik take his pick here. There's a huge amount of, you mentioned Debo in your roster, for example, 4 Debo teams of 8%. There's a lot of interesting names. I know Zach is very interested in Jamar Chase, and if he's healthy this week, just 4 Jamar Chase teams, 4 Amon-Ra St. Brown teams, 4 Rashee Rice, 3 for JSN, 3 for Zay Flowers. Lots and lots of interesting names on this particular list. And we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, Shawn, that on back-to-back weeks, DeAndre Hopkins both broke our hearts and then broke our hearts again for 2 very different reasons. He's on 1 team in this particular format, so there's lots of players that could make big differences, even the likes of a DK Metcalf only rostered on 1 team. Erik, who scares you in the less than 10%, or is it a player that you have that you think will make the difference for you?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I'm definitely excited to have the heavy Ram stack going into the weekend. So I have both Kupp and Nakua on the squad paired with Stafford. So from the last slide, I'm terrified of Kyron Williams eating up all the touchdowns. But if that does not happen, I feel good that game will generate some points, and hopefully they'll go to the right players. So those are 2 guys I'm very excited to have. I think in terms of the scariest on this list, and I'm very glad that he's only down at 3 teams rostered, but is Justin Jefferson. I think that's the hammer game on Sunday night, and with the rest of the Vikings seemingly, on IR and likely not to play, I could just see him, racking up like a 15 target game and doing one of his classic 100+ yards and a couple touchdowns. So
Shawn, that was the final game. That was a Sunday night football game 2 seasons ago when we were with an Aaron Rodgers, Devontae Williams team, that the Packers were so far ahead at halftime that they just canned it. We had 2 first half Devontae Adams touchdowns, and Shawn, then it was all down to, speaking of Baker Mayfield, could have come all full circle this year. It was him and Jarvis Landry on Monday Night Football that didn't get us over the line. But Shawn, any names here before we get into things that we do want to talk about from 2 years ago? Anything here standing out for you?
I think that there are going to be some big games from some unlikely sources. I think that will be part of the story. And we have players like a Marvin Mims. I'm excited to see how the benching of Russell Wilson perhaps impacts how they play. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be an overall upgrade. That would be a little bit of a surprise, but sometimes it will unlock a specific player. Mims, someone who has had no impact this year, but if somebody caught a couple of 60-yard touchdowns, I mean, he has the type of profile who could do that. Jalen Hyatt, somebody who has a couple of big games this year and then a bunch of zeros.
Yeah.
But if you're going to have the big game here, this would be the time for it.
Scenario.
I mean, Erik, bouncing back to you, do you have a player on your roster who hasn't scored hardly any points for you that you think that week 17 could be his coming out party?
Yes, I do. I was hoping you'd throw it my way. So Saturday night, got Detroit Lions and the Dallas Cowboys. And
Jameson time.
One and only Jameson Williams has been heating up a little bit last few weeks. More and more playing time, getting some targets, looking good. Seems like Dan Campbell's fired up to have some JMO. So I would love a bomb or two to him for a touchdown, and it honestly would help negate some of the kind of heavy Detroit Lions ownership on Laporta and Amon-Ra and guys like that. So I would love a JMO game for the one time.
Yeah, and Shawn mentioned Russell Wilson, being benched and Marvin Mims. I do have, although it will be beneficial to non-Russell Wilson teams like our team in this contest, that we're losing Sam Howell, who has played really bad the last 2 weeks, and we kind of had that fear it could happen. That was a real surprise over the last couple of days, with them benching him this week ahead of the final. So I have to, feel a little bit of empathy with the Russell Wilson managers this week entering this competition. Shawn, I did do a deep dive. It took me a little bit of time there, but 2008, week 16, 34 to the Giants, 28 to the Panthers. We got D'Angelo Williams, 24 for 108 and 4 touchdowns. It was Brandon Jacobs, 24 for 87, 3 touchdowns going his way. But Shawn, there was 3 touchdowns to Brandon Jacobs in that game. Derek Ward had 15 carries for 215 yards and no touchdowns in that game. So the running backs were...
It was an insane game. It was crazy.
The running backs were lighting things up in that particular game. Both quarterbacks sub 186 passing yards. So all about the running game in that week 16 clash for the fantasy.
We were involved in a free-for-all, and it's like the team was the best team, was going to score a lot of points. It reminds me a lot of this past week where Pat and I are in the 1250 level RotoViz Triflex. We scored 190 behind Breece Hall, Christian McCaffrey, Josh Allen, what have you. We're 9 points down going into the second week of it. The Amari Cooper manager put up 199. And I mean, I probably shouldn't be bringing this up at this point in time, but that's structured so the first place is 7,000, second place is 2,500. I would like to win. So we'll see how that goes. Tom, who's going to be the MVP from this board here in week 17?
I really like a lot of the matchups that I've got on my roster this weekend. I think the Ravens kind of stack against Miami. If things go nuclear, I'll be very happy. But yeah, for me, it comes back to either Deebo Samuel, because Washington plays so much too high looks and he's just dominating against them. He is the first read on pretty much all of those. Or perhaps Puka Nacua, because the Giants, their defense has just completely tailed off. So I've got more confidence in those two players than virtually anybody, particularly the running back room. It just feels like I'm skating by a little bit, and I feel like that's what's going to let me down mostly.
With your team, Tom, obviously Cortland Sutton, I mentioned earlier in the show, in concussion protocol. We had seen players who were in concussion protocol basically never be out of concussion protocol for the following week. Over the last 3 weeks, I don't know what the changes in the protocol are, but a lot more players are getting out of the protocol within the same week. But obviously, if he plays, any concerns with the switch from Russell Wilson? But you have a few players here, which in a team that has been quite healthy throughout the season, a couple of players heading into this week outside of the quarterback position that have some concerns around them. Addison, Sutton, how are you feeling? And the other question I just have to you was, I was going to ask you your concerns. I'm trying to set up your concerns here for you. But the other part of it was Shawn mentioned our roster, and we'll look at it in a little bit more depth in a minute. But we drafted 2 quarterbacks. You have 4 quarterbacks, 6 running backs, 6 wide receiver, 3 tight end build here. Was that an approach you were taking in this contest or in general with Superflex this season? How do you feel about it at this point overall?
So it wasn't typically what I was going after for quarterback builds. I mean, I love the RotoViz tools you guys have for looking at what's historically worked in these drafts. And I spend a lot of time in the off season kind of like playing with different permutations and working out, okay, what's been slightly more optimal. If I take a quarterback here, how much should I be aiming for? But it was more just a little bit of a hedge against Baker Mayfield, who was my QB3, really. Like, I didn't have as much faith as apparently I should have had in Baker Mayfield. And I didn't ever feel as much conviction about Sam Howell as you guys did. So for me, it was looking at going, okay, can I, hammer together a third quarterback between two different players? And I took Jacoby Brissett in round 18, at which point, obviously, picks don't really kill you as much if you get them wrong. And it's been one of those very few rosters I've had in the Superflex format where all my quarterbacks have stayed healthy. Like, I think so much of what we're seeing across best ball tournaments this year are teams that haven't had a full roster of quarterbacks. Like, I had teams advancing into week 16 with no healthy quarterbacks, and you can get by at certain levels, but sooner or later that attrition just catches up on you. So yeah, I think quarterback, I have no worries about it whatsoever. But then between Brian Robinson being banged up and having little reason to come back and play, Devin Singletary taking on the Titans, who are a good run defense when they want to be, and then Jordan Addison and Cortland Sutton being banged up, it feels like I'm probably going to be relying on a second tight end in my flex spot, and I'm going to need two quarterbacks in my starting lineup as well. So I don't have as much wiggle room as I've had for the entire season, definitely.
Yeah, and it can be interesting. Like, for example, if Mark Andrews was healthy going into this week, like, tight end would be much more of a concern. So there is certain things that have worked out throughout the season to fall into those parts. But that team that me and Shawn mentioned from 2 years ago, we were, like, at this point trying to pitch together, like, the threading the needle between the injuries and hoping at that point that Elijah Moore was going to be back off injured reserve to give us an extra, attempt to add some points to the lineup. And you touched on the quarterback injuries, which has been a big factor. So you have 4 healthy starting quarterbacks heading into this weekend, which not a lot of teams are going to have at this particular point. And the other part of that, as Shawn did mention, having those other players filling in as your second flex. But this is a roster which will likely be driven by the second flex being the quarterback, which would also make sense in this particular instance.
I'm terrified of that Dak Prescott, Lamar Jackson double there. I mean, that could wipe us all out.
Yeah, like if they have big days and put up 25 plus into the 30, like those guys can put up 35 points each, and then like that is. Well, that's why you drafted them. That's the reason for it. Moving in, Eric, to your roster here, led by Brock Purdy, who had a tougher week last week. But you mentioned, I'm surprised as well. There's quite a few. There's 14% Bryce Young teams. I don't think they're being powered by Young himself. I think they're being dragged along with him. But Matthew Stafford, you mentioned him, and then you have Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, which could give you a big edge because there's just 6 Matthew Stafford teams, 5 Cooper Kupp teams, and then you have 5 Puka teams as well. So it is one of those situations when you're looking at pivot points between the different rosters as to where those points go. When you're looking at particularly the likes of the Lions and then you're looking at the 49ers, there's just so many ways those touchdowns and so on can be divided up. But this is a situation where if it's through the air, you're in really good shape because you also have Tyler Higbee. And if it's on the ground, it's going to be one of those ones where you're cursing Sean McVay at the end of the day.
Yes, it definitely could be. Yeah, and I was tilting the I guess it was Thursday last week when Cooper Kupp had a couple potential end zone catches that they were tough catches, but I would classify them as drops, and those were painful. And so I'm crossing my fingers that does not happen again this week. I'm feeling good about the squad. Like I said earlier, I think in terms of
pretty
concerns,
healthy.
Yeah, very healthy, which I'm thankful for. Concerns is probably tight end. It's probably, despite having 4, probably one of the weaker tight end rooms I drafted on FFPC this year. So I'm hoping we can get some kind of 20-point score out of that collection of guys. I haven't heard if Henry is going to be healthy and back this week, but that would be a big boost. And then probably the second concern, I feel great about the running backs. To Sean's point about quarterbacks, I feel great having Purdy and Stafford and hoping they can fill one of the slots. I think it's probably at receiver. Like I have some good receivers, but like you really need at least 3 big scores from receiver, and I could see getting 1, maybe 2 from Kupp, Nakua, and then hopefully Ayuk is the guy. But beyond that, definitely some thinner plays if Waddle is not playing. So certainly hope Waddle will miraculously be playing this week. But if not, I think receiver is the other area where I'm just hoping I can get kind of that big 3rd or 4th scorer to put in the lineup.
Yeah, so you have the 2 Lions and Gibbs and Williams, and then you have the 2 49ers and McCaffrey and Ayuk. And obviously those guys can all get there and put up big numbers, but that path is a little bit more, it's tighter for both of them to hit. But I guess the other part of that is you have 2 darts at 2 of the higher scoring offenses in the NFL. So, it can still work out for you. But I have to say, the one thing I would pick out of this team is it's a 3-5-8-4 roster. You mentioned you're comfortable with the running backs. To have 5 running backs of Christian McCaffrey, Gibbs, Tony Pollard hasn't had the season that we have hoped for so far, but then Chuba Hubbard, who's had a really strong finish this season, and have Ford in there as well. That's even though we're probably disappointed in Pollard's season, I think you've nailed picking 5 running backs, because 5 running backs can be thin selections on a roster of this size. How did you manage that, and can you give us your secret?
Erik, you and I drafted quite a few teams together, and you've taken this idea of waiting on the quarterbacks, not to an extreme necessarily, but certainly you followed one of the things that we were talking about, where if you don't get a clear QB1, to wait on it. And it's given you an incredible team in terms of running backs and wide receivers by sort of punting on both QB and tight end, which again has some downsides, as you mentioned. But to have a team with McCaffrey, Gibbs, and Pollard that also has Ayuk, Kupp, and Waddle, to be able to get Kupp through, even though he has the bad season, to have all that firepower. And then, this team here is a real tribute to great late round drafting as well, because your quarterbacks are actually strong. You hit on both Hubbard and Ford. You hit on Nakua. This team is so loaded. And partly what you did was rely on the idea that the evidence does suggest that waiting on a QB will work, but then also you relied on your strength as a drafter and believed in yourself to hit on some of these guys. Now, we talk about overconfidence sometimes and how we want to be careful about that, but you also, you have to believe that you could actually draft a good team, and you've gone out and you've drafted a great team here.
Cool. Well, I appreciate that. But yeah, I definitely leaned into the late quarterback this year in Superflex and feel really good about how that turned out. I wish that I kind of included like Herbert and Mahomes and Burrow in that kind of top quarterback tier that I always would take in the first round if they were there. And those picks certainly did not work out. But punting kind of the rest of the quarterbacks from the end of round 1 through about round 3 was really helpful in the tournament this year.
So, Shawn, as we move on here, Zach did ask me to get Shawn Siegele's thoughts on his roster that he's feeling pretty good about. He was disappointed he couldn't jump on with us to make it a bigger round table here as we get ready for this weekend. But he is also a Baker Mayfield team with Jared Goff. When we look through it, some interesting players for him. Hopkins at just 1 team. Obviously, that will probably be the team to break our heart this weekend. But then we get Jamar Chase 4, Cooper Kupp like yourself, Eric, George Pickens, who has got through, is Olave like ourselves. But he has Trey McBride, who, although did not work out last week, has been a landslide at tight end recently. But it's a Achane team. There's only 5 Achane rosters. Rashad White is in there as well. Kenneth Walker, Shawn, 3%, or 3 teams, 6% rostered. The other thing I was going to mention, he has a Taysom Hill team, and I know there was issues with Taysom Hill and his position allocation earlier at the very deadline of the NFL season. He did slot in a quarterback for 2 weeks for this roster, which I thought was interesting as well. But Zach has a 4-6-7-3 team. Some crossover between the combination of our rosters, but also I think quite a unique roster all around. Shawn, hit us with your thoughts.
Well, I know that Zach was, I don't overstate it, but furious about Hill not being a tight end. And
I don't think you're not selling it enough, Shawn. I don't think furious.
It would have worked out in a huge way if he were there. But Zach has us all beat because he has the absolute tournament winner in Trey McBride. I mean, we know that Trey McBride is the fantasy MVP, the best tight end in the NFL. I mean, if Kyler Murray weren't such a low-end quarterback, he would probably be, scoring 30 points a game. I think that this team wins through McBride, and I'm going to go out on a ledge and say, I mean, this is the week that our hyper-talented or our ultra-talented running backs, this is going to be the Achane week. This is going to be the Kenneth Walker week. I mean, Kenneth Walker needs to break about 25 tackles in a game to get to his 100 yards and 2 touchdowns, but he is uniquely capable of
he also
doing
needs
that.
to run. He needs to run for 200 yards to accumulate 100 rushing yards.
It's interesting because at this point, Charbonnet is barely playing, and yet he does manage to go in for the only snaps that matter. So the path to Walker getting a big game is tricky, but yeah, you look at this, and certainly if Chris Olave can go off, that would not only help Zach, but Colm, it would help you and I as well.
Yeah, selfishly, it would certainly help us. But the thing I like when we look through our rosters, we'll go back to ours now, but even at the top-heavy players, like on our team here, we have the Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, then Chris Olave, Cole Kmet, that are all 20+%. But then there is enough uniqueness across the rest of the rosters where like they are only a handful of teams across the board. So even having high rostered players is not much, as I mentioned at the start, a concern at all. And there's enough different ways to differentiate yourself at the end of it. So I think that's going to make for a lot of fun this weekend. Shawn, I'll get your thoughts first. I'll get the guys' thoughts then. We obviously have Sam Howell unlikely to accumulate points this week. There was just the 2 Sam Howell teams, which could have been quite a unique process in terms of filling that spot. But as you mentioned as well, we have only really had one quarterback throughout the entirety of the season, with Fields being out and now Howell being out and his underperformance the last couple of weeks. But I think the running backs, and including Ty Chandler now, starting to get a little bit more. Roschon Johnson has looked okay and has limited opportunities, but I think there's a huge amount of upside here. And the one player I was quite surprised in our team, when I'm thinking about James Cook, I was surprised by that, obviously, but Rashee Rice only having 4 teams out of 50 at 8% really surprised me this week, because he has been pretty consistently strong over the last couple of weeks. So he is somebody, Shawn, in your Kansas City Chiefs, I think could make a really big difference here for this roster as well.
Yeah, this was a little bit of a meltdown week. Sometimes keeping your composure for a long stretch of time, as I would argue that Patrick Mahomes has done up until the last couple of weeks, then when you finally break, you break in such a big way that maybe you should have let off some steam.
You shatter.
Previous to that. The Chiefs are not in a great place right now, but I do think that Rashee Rice is one of the answers for them. As I mentioned, I just have a lot of confidence that, I mean, again, if we win, we need something a little bit unexpected and fun to happen. You have to have a little bit of that magic to get the title. I think Quentin Johnston, Marvin Mims, or Jalen Hyatt will go off. I don't have the same confidence for Jahan Dotson or Chase Claypool, although, if there's a positive about Jacoby, yeah, I mean, if Jacoby Brissett goes in and maybe he's like, I don't think that Sam Howell was going to be in our starting lineup if we win.
No.
So losing him doesn't bother me. I mean, obviously it cuts down on your pass, but it doesn't bother me. And maybe it makes Dotson the player here. I mean, basically, it just doesn't look like Jahan Dotson can actually play. So that's a bigger problem than who's throwing him the ball.
Shawn, we're meant to be building up his confidence ahead of this weekend's game, not telling him that he can't play football.
Well, I mean, you got to look at this team from the perspective of, what's happening. We're gonna build the exciting scenarios while at the same time thinking through what the guys have actually brought to the table. I think that Quentin Johnston too. I mean, I mentioned the other 2 players, but you break a couple of big plays. He's looked more confident. One of the things with Johnston is you could argue that maybe there have been too many intermediate passes where he is a deep threat. He's a manufactured touch guy. And let's see a game where they manufacture some of those touches like TCU did. I mean, he could run with the ball in his hands. Let's get in the ball in his hands. Again, we're going to see something unique in this game. And one of the things that didn't help us last week, but could come into being in a way that really makes a difference, I think that Ty Chandler has the potential to go off for a 150-2 kind of game. Certainly not predicting that, but you look at the different scenarios. It's funny to see Tank Bigsby here. We had a ton of Travis Etienne. this is really our only Bigsby share, I think, across our entire portfolio. He dropped multiple rounds below where he usually goes.
And Shawn,
this was draft that doesn't necessarily matter, but
this was.
Are you excited that our one Bigsby share is here in the final?
Oh, very excited. But this was at the height of the Bigsby, propaganda in the preseason. This was like where we just couldn't believe that he didn't get drafted up higher, because that was the point where we continued to stay on the ETN side of things. We continued to draft him, continued, and this is the only team I am sure of that we drafted him on. But Shawn, who knows? And you're hyping up some of these guys. I feel like we're going to have at least 230 points this week, so we should be in with a shot. Tight end is where I'm most concerned. If it was a case that Colm did miss out, obviously we've Greg Dulcich, who is on injured reserve, but there's still a potential that he could be activated. But if Komet would miss, it's solely on Pitts, which is a precarious situation.
He's gonna go big. Tom, how many points is it going to take to win this week? How are you seeing the top 10 finish? Where do we need to be pointing? How do we need to be rooting as we go through these games?
Well, yeah, we've definitely seen some different weeks over the last few weeks of this tournament. I think that looking at the amount of matchups and looking at, okay, we've got 54-point over-under in the Saturday night game between Dallas and Detroit. We've got the Miami-Baltimore game, which is a 47-point over-under. You've got Arizona-Philly, which is a 48-point over-under. We haven't had weeks like this with this many high over-unders throughout the season. And that's San Francisco-Washington, that's 48.5 over-under. So if all of these games hit in the way that the bookies are expecting them to, I think you're talking 170, 180 to really be in with a shot of it.
Yeah, I was going to set, when we're thinking about like the over-under in terms of what would be a massive week usually in this format, is going to be like, if you're over 190, it's a massive week, even with the Superflex, because it's not adding the Superflex, it's just adding the option for that flex to be a quarterback. So I think to be in the mix, I think if you're in the over 180, I think you're really in the mix to win it. And I think once you start approaching 190, 200, you have a chance. But the unfortunate thing for any other teams is we are going to have 230 plus. So you can battle it out for second place.
That is going to set the standard pretty high. We scored 191 to win our pod in week 15. We scored 175, I believe, to win our pod in week 2. Erik, do you remember what your scores were the last couple of weeks and how that kind of fit into the rest of the group there?
Yeah, I had actually week 15, I had a massive week. I was at 221. And then last week I was at 180. I think my team has scored over 160 ever since week 10, so feeling good about that. But yeah,
what are your highs for the year?
I would need to go back and look. That 220 was probably the high. I think, because I think on average, I had a good team. I finished first, but it wasn't like near the top of the leaderboard. I think I averaged like 150 points a week, so it definitely came on stronger at the end. So I think, I think we're going to have to crest 200 to win. And I think probably maybe even above 210. So I think we'll have to have some pretty monster scores.
That would be pretty.
Sounds like we're lucky we weren't in with Erik. Do you remember your 2 scores?
I'm just scrolling back through some of them now. I kind of got by. I was second place in both my playoff pods and just kind of scraped in a little bit. I was quite nervous going to bed over here in the UK. Like, I went to bed at a point where I wasn't sure if the Ravens were going to do enough to drag my team in, and I ended up at 176, 10 points clear of third place. But the week before, I'd had 171. Looking back through the season, I had plenty of sort of 170, 180s, a couple of 190s. I don't think I crept over 200 at any point, though.
Yeah,
so on our team, Shawn,
I was looking through pod, I had both my teams, or 2 of my Superflex teams, were in the same pod, and both of them scored 220. So
and did they both
I felt bad for whoever else was in that pod. Yeah, they both went through, and
awesome.
The other one lost this last week, but it was kind of an odd coincidence. I think I only had like 4 or 5 teams in the tournament, and 2 were together.
But it's awesome to get 2 out of the 12 to go through like that. I was looking, Shawn, at ours, and this team was a team that up until the last week, it snuck over the line. It was kind of going from second to third to second to third over that period of time, but it was more a case that we consistently scored than we scored high. Our highest during the entire season was 180.6. We had a 178.7, and week 14 was 162.3, which helped get us through. But there's nothing like outlandish in any of the weeks. A lot of them are in the 120 to 150 range, and that's probably why we were battling to get through. And I had mentioned like the two teams that I liked the most, that I, solo teams that I had drafted, they were like a bit like, it sounds like your team, cresting, 160 plus every single week throughout the way, but they bounced once the Sam Laporta and Trey McBride stuff didn't work out. But in terms of our team, Shawn, the one thing I have thought about it throughout has been the consistency. And even last week, for example, when we were looking at how that went, the only player that had a big week really last week, the only player plus Christian McCaffrey was the second highest scored at 25 points, and the other player then was Breece Hall, obviously had 40 points. But we have a lot of players who have been consistently like 15 to 25 points. So I kind of feel like if any of those have a big week this week, that's really where it's going to push us over, because I'm pretty confident that the rest of the guys are going to put up numbers that will be able to fill all the spots across the board. We just need a couple of... There's a question, how many 30-point games do you think you need in this? Because we might have a player that, gets that 40-point game like a Christian McCaffrey, and then, it doesn't take a lot else to fill in that 180 points that we're talking about from the rest of the players.
I'm looking for 30 plus from CMC, Hall, and Cook all together. That's our path with
90.
The 3 stars. This has been such a fun exercise. I'm so excited to have been able to have you all on. I feel like the good vibes from this, or at least my pleasure and enjoyment of being able to share it with you and hear what you guys are thinking, makes me more confident, not necessarily about our team, but just from this group having somebody do well, which would just be so exciting. Tom, share with the listeners anything else that you would like on any topic. What other things are you looking for in week 17 across the different things you're involved in? Give us some good vibes as we head into New Year's.
Yeah, I mean, most of my best ball teams are all dead, is often the way, but this is the one which, like, yeah, I think a lot of people can heavily relate to that. But for me, it's just really the best ball community has become such a great place to be. And yes, there are weeks where it can feel a bit miserable, where like week 15, where everybody loses a huge percent of teams that they felt really good about, and that. But going into week 17, we are days away from millions of dollars being doled out in prize money. And honestly, if it's not somebody on this stream, it's hopefully somebody who I interact with, or whether it's somebody who's part of the Discord that we run on the Fantasy Sanctuary. I know a lot of we've got 4 or 5 members in there with hopes of big money this weekend. And to everybody who's got those kind of sweats, whether it's for a dynasty league, whether it's the home league, they all matter, because fantasy matters. And I'm just excited to see how it plays out, and then get into the off season. I mean, I just love the off season and getting into all the data.
Yeah, so the off season's not far away, but we will enjoy one more week of like the pinnacle of the fantasy football season. Tom mentioned in passing there the Fantasy Sanctuary. Check out their YouTube channel and all the great stuff that they're doing over there. And you can follow Tom as well on Twitter at NFL_Tstrack. In terms of the game on this side of the Atlantic, I know obviously a lot of the players are over there in the US, but the game has expanded massively in the UK and Ireland, but I would say more so in the UK population. And Tom's doing a great job with like heavily sharing information around the best ball side of things. So shout out to Tom for that. Erik, what's going on for week 17 and what are we excited about here?
Yeah, I'm incredibly excited and really just grateful to have a team in the mix. It's what you play for is just to be here and to have a chance, and probably the most exciting time of the year from a fantasy perspective. So super excited for that, and really just grateful for just fantasy in general. It just gives me a great fun outlet in life, and I think the reason I'm so into it is because of the communities around RotoViz and ship chasing. It's awesome to have great people that you can draft with and cut it up with and strategize with. So yeah, just grateful to be here and have a chance, and hoping that one of us will take it down.
Yeah, and I just remembered as we're getting ready to sign off here, this show, coming up to the end of December, our next show, Shawn, I believe, will be in 2024. Obviously, we're right at the end of December. We're heading into January, but obviously we may have to do an emergency podcast, Shawn, if this team comes in first place. But we'll see. Of course, the best way to get the shows once they're available is go to your podcast feed, subscribe to RotoViz Overtime. You'll get them all once they are available. But good luck to everyone playing this weekend, whether it's in your redraft league, your dynasty league, no matter what format it is in. Whether you're in BBM4, let's bring home some of that big cash money. But until we are back, my name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. Check out Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until next time, have a good one.